to begin by thanking everyone for being here over the past 2 days. It's been really fantastic. And I'm very excited about this next session. We're going to introduce Amanda Martin. This presentation looks at why climate resilience is essential to social equity, especially in the areas of walking, biking, and using a wheelchair. And our presenter is Amanda Martin. Amanda is a Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the state of North Carolina and is passionate about building resilience in ways that advance economic prosperity, strengthen housing options, and celebrate cultural and natural heritage. In her current work in the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, she advances the state's resilience through policy advising, stakeholder engagement, and technical assistance. So Amanda, welcome, and you're up.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And let's see, get it into the slideshow mode. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Amanda Martin. I'm a Deputy Chief Resilience Officer with the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. And before I say too much more, I wanted to give you all a chance to put your name and your organization or the city or place where you live into the chat box. And I don't want to create a chat explosion, but just to get a sense of where folks are coming from, I can tailor my comments to that. And I wanted to say a big thank you to everybody for being here this afternoon. I know it's Friday afternoon, it's the end of a summit, and I'm sure everybody's either been obsessively hitting refresh on their news feed or obsessively trying not to hit refresh on their news feed. So I hope to be able to be here with you and engage you all. There'll be some questions that are more hypothetical questions posed throughout the presentation. I encourage you to take notes, or if you want to put your answers into the chat box, feel free to. Just some food for thought to keep us all awake and alive on Friday afternoon. And there'll be a question and answer period at the end. So let's see. All right, my presentation is called Climate Resilience is Essential to Social Equity for Walking, Biking, and Using a Wheelchair. I work at the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. We are an office inside the Department of Public Safety. Our office does mostly work on long-term disaster recovery, especially in Eastern North Carolina. But we have a few staff, myself included, who work on resiliency more broadly across the state. In terms of what I'll talk about today, the first part of my talk, I'll talk about climate change and resilience and kind of these terms and what they mean. In the next section, I'll talk about the climate equity bike walk roll connection, and just a note about the language that I use. I try to include and center wheelchair users in my work. So that's the roll part of it. And I like to try to kind of change up the order in which we use the words, because it turns out these kinds of semantics are actually pretty important to those of us who are working on equity and justice issues. And a final note about rolling is that I'm a parent of 2 kids under the age of 3. And so the kinds of things that make it possible for people to get around in wheelchairs are really important to me, because I often have to get around with a stroller. So that's a little bit about my language that I'll use today. And then finally, the last part of this session, I'll talk about advancing equity via resilience strategies and the path forward. So the first section, as I said, I'll talk about climate change and resilience. So consider for a moment what happened the last time weather affected your transportation choice or your transportation experience. So a few examples might be that it was so windy that I got nervous riding my bike in the street, or it rained and I got wet waiting for the bus to work, and then I had wet clothes at work, or maybe it was too hot last summer to walk to my neighbor's party and I drove instead. Just start thinking about when was the last time that weather really impacted transportation for me. Then moving, why am I asking about weather? Weather is sort of the micro of climate. Climate is our long-term patterns in weather. And so if this analogy works for you, weather tells you what to wear each day when you wake up, and climate tells you what kinds of clothes you need to have in your closet. So climate is that overall long-term pattern of weather, which is why People often can kind of grasp onto the weather that we experience every day. It's a little bit easier to connect your personal experience to that than it is to climate. But climate is really just this big picture that's meaningful to us because it creates our weather. We have a new resource on climate change in North Carolina. It was issued in June of this past year. It's called the North Carolina Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan. And this plan, I apologize, it is layered under a few layers of government, state government web pages. But if you Google it, you should be able to find it. And if somebody wants to drop the link into the chat box, please feel free to do that. But it should be easily findable. If it's not, for some reason, email me afterwards. I'd be happy to send you a link or a copy. But I would encourage you to look through this resource. It's hundreds of pages. Use the table of contents wisely, but it provides information about the climate future that we expect. It has a science report in it that's peer reviewed. And so we feel very solid about the language that's used in it for those whose work may be impacted by people with different beliefs about climate change. This is very much backed by scientists and created by a coalition of scientists. It also includes suggested strategies for climate resilience. So lots of different kinds of ideas about how we can incorporate climate resilience into our work. And so there's a whole chapter on transportation. Maybe that's your interest. There's a chapter on climate and environmental justice. Maybe that's your interest. So there's a whole fantastic chapter on natural and working lands. Maybe that's your, an environmental interest. Lots of great stuff in there. And the final way I'd suggest that you might be able to use this is that if you're interested in doing resilience work from the perspective of wherever you sit, see this as a resource that documents this North Carolina state government's commitment to climate change and climate resilience. And in fact, it comes out of an executive order issued by Governor Cooper, Executive Order 80, which is the governor's commitment to climate change mitigation and adaptation. And it had a lot to do with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it also has a section about climate resilience. So if you are considering applying for a grant that would relate to resilience, this is a great report to cite or a plan to cite. Or if you are advocating for a particular policy that would help advance resilience in our bike, walk, roll infrastructure, this is a great plan to cite. So I encourage you to see this resource and use it in whatever way is helpful for you. I'll share a little bit of what's in it. The bumper sticker version of climate change in North Carolina is that we're looking at a hotter, wetter, and more humid North Carolina. And I think for all of us who think about transportation that involves being outdoors, we know what that means. The science is virtually certain that sea level will continue to rise. So this really impacts our coastal community. It's very likely that summer heat index values will increase, and it's likely that annual total precipitation will increase, hurricane intensity will increase, severe droughts will become more intense, and the increase in precipitation will lead to an increase in inland flooding. And so I think for all of those have implications for getting around without a car. I don't know, maybe severe droughts doesn't. If anyone has ideas about the connection there, let me know. But pretty much everything else has a lot to do, really impacts the experience and the safety of getting around, biking, walking, or rolling. So when we talk about climate change, we're looking at long-term patterns, and because it's so holistic and because we have to be so interdisciplinary in our work with climate change adaptation, we also think about non-climate stressors. So I didn't want to sort of breeze through and not talk about how these other things intersect with climate. So population growth, especially where we're growing, impacts how climate change will affect our community, where flooding will happen, for example. We have aging infrastructure in our state, and so how safe our infrastructure is for this kind of weather matters. We have socioeconomic disparities that put a chronic pressure on certain populations and on our overall systems. And I know equity is why is the theme of the summit, and it's the focus of my presentation here today. And then other kind of factors that we think about a lot are like man-made disasters, kind of like terrorism types of things that come my office sits in public safety, so we have to, make a nod to that. Also, the rural-urban divide, we know that very different things are happening in North Carolina's urban communities that are happening in their rural communities. And disaster recovery really makes this clear, where our rural areas are exploding with growth, our urban areas are exploding with growth, and our rural areas are losing population, and really many of them are economically distressed. And then finally, public health threats and pandemics. You can bet that was thrown in there at the last moment. But COVID has really revealed a lot about common threads of resilience across natural hazards and public health, that there are certain capacities and relationships that are really important, no matter what kind of a stressor we're looking at. One quote to pull from the Climate Risk Assessment and Resilience Plan is, all modes of transportation must be assessed for resilience to build adaptive capacity and redundancy moving forward. So I'll talk about what some of those concepts mean, but I think if there's any sentence that's most widely applicable to the work that everyone on this session does, it might be that one sentence. So what is resilience? When we talk about resilience, I'll give you a few different ways to look at it. It's kind of one of those words that everybody started using to make it sound like, everything is resilience, and kind of who can be against resilience. So we try to be a little bit more specific in our work. And this is an image that my boss, the Chief Resilience Officer, Dr. Jess Whitehead, developed actually she's an adjunct professor, and her student made this comment, and I think it's so apt, that sort of, when we don't, for a lot of people who kind of throw around the word resilience, they think of this punching bag version of resilience, where, the punch is the storm and we're the punching bag, and we have this impact, and then the resilience is the amount of time it takes for us as a society to land back to where we started, like where the punching bag started. And the faster we can do that, the more resilient we are. And the kind of challenge that I want to put out to that idea is that, are we starting out in the place that we actually want to be in the first place? Is the baseline good enough for us? Is it the best we can do? And we think that in a lot of cases, it's not, and we can do better, and that resilience can aim for something better. So sometimes we say not just bouncing back, but bouncing forward. Okay, so we think of resilience as a quality of systems that overcome past, present, and future harms. And the systems that we might talk about, they could be social systems. So that might be, something like a public education system, but it also could be something not very tangible, like our social norms, our economic systems, that's our economy and kind of the way that it functions at different scales of geography. We have lots of natural systems, water systems, ecosystems that are play critical functions to our resilience, particularly with respect to flooding, but also for heat. And then we have the built environment, which I'm sure is the world that a lot of folks in this session live in professionally. So that's everything that humans construct, our buildings, our infrastructure, our roads, kind of how those relate to one another. That's kind of a built environment system. And is that system able to overcome past, present, and future harms? That's what we think about with resilience. And I have one more slide on defining resilience. Hopefully this isn't beating the dead horse, but for those of you who work in local government, they have hazard mitigation plans. And so I'd encourage us to think about resilience as hazard mitigation, which is reducing, it's things like levees and kind of armoring ourselves against hazards. So it's that physical piece plus the social, economic, and environmental components of what keeps us safe when there is harm. So this is our very long-winded definition. A resilient North Carolina is a state where our communities, economies, and ecosystems can rebound from, positively adapt to, and thrive amid changing conditions and challenges, including natural disasters and climate change, while improving quality of life for all maintaining healthy growth, increasing shared prosperity, building durable systems, and conserving resources for present and future generations. So that is our mission. That is my professional mission. What I wake up every day and go to work in this at-home closet office to do. So now that we've talked about climate change and what resilience is, I'd like to make this connection, the climate equity bike walk roll connection. So when we talk about equity and transportation in North Carolina, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to kind of raise these questions over the course of the 2 days, in your community, who relies on walking, rolling, and biking to get around? And so I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but if we think of the world of users of these modes of transportation, that whole world is really important. What if we center the world of people who use those modes of transportation because they do not have another choice? They rely on that mode to get around. So think about who in your community, wherever you live or work, who are those folks? So I'll talk a little bit about commuting patterns in North Carolina. We have nearly 50,000 people who use public transportation to get to work, almost 10,000 people who get to work by a bicycle, and 85,000 people who walk to work. And so those are great numbers. And what I also want to point out is that this is just a baseline. Commuters are, by definition, they're workers. It's workers age 16 and older. So this does not even include trips that non-workers are taking. And it also doesn't include a lot of necessary trips that all of us take, for example, to and from school, daycare, a grocery store, a parent's home, etc. And these are trips that actually disproportionately women take. So there is kind of a skew when we look at data just as commuting patterns. And of course, it also tends to exclude senior citizens who may be retired. It excludes people with disabilities who don't work. So there's kind of a lot of parents who don't work. Just kind of a grain of salt with social equity implications to keep in mind. So here's a few data points. And I used public transportation here because that was the data I have available. It's sort of a proxy because most people who use public transportation, biking or walking is some component of their commute. I apologize that I don't have like bike, walk, roll exclusively data here. But young workers ages 16 to 24 are 12% of the workforce, but 21% of the workers who use public transportation. African Americans, 20% of the workforce, but 45% of workers who use public transportation. Workers in or close to poverty are nearly 15% of the workforce and nearly 35% of workers who use public transportation. And then finally, this is an industry group, arts, entertainment, recreation, and accommodations. And I pulled this out because workers in these industries these industries tend to have jobs that are lower paying, hourly jobs with less job security. So these are sort of economically vulnerable workers. They are 9.4% of the workforce, but nearly 20% of workers who use public transportation. So what am I saying here? It tells us that a lot of workers, these data tell us that a lot of workers rely on walking, biking, and public transit in North Carolina. And a lot of the workers who rely on these modes have some kind of, they lack equal access to political capital or economic capital, or they face discrimination, that there's sort of this overlap of people who rely on bike, walk, roll, and people who face other kinds of challenges, marginalization in their life. And given all of that, these statistics are still missing a huge number of trips made for reasons other than commuting to work, and a huge number of people who aren't workers in the way that the census defines them. So if you are a person who works in an organization devoted to social equity, I think this data should suggest that including bike, walk, and roll issues in your mission or in your agency, organization's work, or at least in your purview, is a critical component to equity. Or if you work in an organization that's really focused on bike, walk, roll, that including social equity is a critical component of making the world, making our state a better place to bike, walk, and roll to get around. And what I'll do is put a climate lens on top of all of that, because I think that there's a unique intersection between equity, bike, walk, roll, and climate. And that has a lot to do with weather. So we started out, I've asked this in a few different ways. What are some ways that bad weather, like heat, rain, and humidity, all of which are expected to increase due to climate change, impact our abilities to use a bicycle or wheelchair or walk to get around? So I have a few images to take a break from words. This is an image, I think this is after Hurricane Florence. It's in Jones County, North Carolina, and you can see it stopped raining, the storm is over, but there's still water on the street. And you can see damage to the roadway and the infrastructure. And you look at this and a car can probably safely drive around this, but can a person walking, can a person using a wheelchair, can a person in a bicycle safely get around this type of infrastructure damage? I don't think so. I would not feel safe using those modes of transportation with these kinds of conditions. This is a picture from Western North Carolina. I think it's Asheville. And it's a picture of a bike path, and we are lucky in North Carolina to have some wonderful trails and bike paths that are along creeks and waterways and lakes. And something to consider is that when those waterways flood, are there alternative ways to get from point A to point B? So for people who rely on that bike path or trail to get where they need to go, are there alternative ways for them to get there? Here's a person walking in water. I forget where this image is from North Carolina. I forget where it is exactly, but this is also to say that there are really important health and safety considerations for getting around under climate change. So obviously it is not safe to walk in water. And here, this image is just, I feel like every one of us probably can relate to being a person who's standing on the sidewalk, waiting for the bus or riding a bike when this car drives past you and you get a big splash on you. So, and not to blame the driver, obviously there's a ton of water on the road, but also that, when we think about how climate change affects bike, walk, roll, we also always have to consider cars and motorized vehicles and how all of those intersect with one another in safe conditions. I'll talk a little bit about heat. Heat is another one of the areas of climate change that we're expected to experience in North Carolina. And heat is really, it is especially impactful to older folks, to people with existing conditions, to outdoor workers. And what we find is that there's this phenomenon called the urban heat island effect. And it's in places that have a lot of impervious surface or have a lot of blacktop and buildings and don't have a lot of tree canopy, that heat kind of concentrates, and it can be up to 10 or more degrees hotter in those areas than it is in surrounding areas. And there's been some research recently that actually overlays the geography of redlining in North Carolina, and I know, or in the United States. I know Dr. Spurlock talked about this in her keynote, the real estate discrimination via what we call redlining in the 30s and 40s, and its implications today. Well, one of the implications is that in redline communities that are historically neighborhoods of color and immigrant neighborhoods, there is less tree canopy, and there's a overlap in the geography of those redlined areas and of urban heat island effect. So we know that urban heat island effect disproportionately occurs it occurs in all neighborhoods that have less tree canopy and more development, and that is disproportionately historic neighborhoods of color, immigrant neighborhoods. And just to highlight health impacts, here's somebody who's waiting for transit. Just again, to highlight that we think about safety and transportation and getting around. We also need to think about economic impacts if you are waiting for work And we need to think about like greater public health considerations of being exposed to high heat through your transportation mode. And this is my final graphic. This is from the World Health Organization. It's their suggestions about how to mitigate personal harm from a heat wave. And the suggestions are to stay in the shade, to avoid going out during the hottest time of the day, to avoid strenuous physical activities if you can, and do not leave children or animals in parked vehicles. And what strikes me about this graphic is that if you rely on biking, walking, or rolling to get around, you don't have a lot of choice in these things. So you can't stay in the shade if you have to wait for the bus and there's no shelter. And you can't avoid going outside during the hottest time of the day if you have to get to work for a shift that starts at 1 or 2 p.m. Similarly, you can't avoid strenuous physical activities if walking is part of getting where you need to go. So a lot of our ways that we can reduce risk to ourselves directly during a heat wave are difficult to do if your transportation involves an active component. So the point that I'm trying to make to kind of sum it up is climate change has distinct and disparate impacts on people who rely on being able to walk, roll, and bike. And the most vulnerable users are those that are most likely to suffer health and economic impacts. So there's kind of this one component that is that users who rely on these modes of transportation are disproportionately exposed to climate change impact, and that users who rely on those modes of transportation are often, they overlap with populations that are increased risk for these impacts. Like they're less able to cope with those impacts. So they may have pre-existing conditions. This is something that we've really pulled the lid off with COVID, that people with pre-existing conditions in the United States are disproportionately people of color. On the economic impact side, if you are someone who relies on public transportation to get around, you're less likely to also be someone who can skip your shift if it's in the middle of a hurricane, or if it's a dangerous kind of weather scenario outside. You are more likely to be unable to afford to skip your shift, if that made sense. There might have been too many negatives there, but basically these two points together. So disparate impacts, and then those who suffer those disparate impacts are tend to be less able to cope with the health and economic impacts. Just checking my time here. So the final part of this session is talking about advancing equity via resilience strategies and the path forward. And so this is where I get really excited, because this is how we can make some progress and integrate resilience into what we're doing. And something I'll say before I launch into this is that working in the resilience world, most of the time, what we encourage our stakeholders to do and decision makers to do is to integrate resilience into what they are already doing, because climate resilience crosses so many disciplinary and industry and sector boundaries. We find that standalone resilience efforts can be useful, but sometimes people it's better to use the bandwidth in areas where organizations are already working and just apply that resilience lens and see what that means. And so kind of the argument I'm going to make is that applying that resilience lens to bike, walk, roll work is advancing equity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So advancing equitable resilience. I don't know if anybody has shown this graphic yet, but I love it. It's a new graphic from FEMA that compares equality and equity as concepts. And equality on the top being the concept of sort of giving everybody the same bike. And then equity on the bottom is the concept of giving people the wheels that they need, that fit their needs to help them get where they need to go. Because what we have seen historically is that when we give everyone the same amount of the same resources, they do not end up at the same place. And it's really equal outcomes that are most important. So as I talk through these concepts and some of the strategies that we use, I encourage you to consider, I have to move my box here, consider some ways that we can integrate equitable resilience into bike, walk, and roll work. And again, this is where I encourage you to think, you don't need to start a new program or get a different grant or something. It may be, it's very likely to be things that you can tweak within your own work or apply a new lens to things you are already doing. So some of the different strategies that I'll talk about: connecting inside and outside your community, learning about risks, integrating resilience across plans and programs, and then I'll share some state resources and plans that we have that may be of use to you. So the first thing is to connect inside and outside your community. And I think this is especially important. So I have an urban planning background, and so I've almost always worked for government, and it can be very difficult to come from the public sector and say there's something that we haven't done that well and we want to do it better. It's very hard to say that, and I completely respect that. And I'm sure, I bet it's hard no matter what sector you work in. But I think that there's something really powerful in approaching that in terms of building new relationships. So maybe you see on this graphic, you may see your organization somewhere, and this is not exhaustive. I was just trying to brainstorm the kinds of organizations and connections that we like to make to advance equity and advance resilience. So in particular, I wanted to call out nonprofit organizations whose missions are about social justice or equal access or environmental justice that, in my experience coming from government, building those relationships by saying, hey, can we just sit down? Can we get to know one another? Here's what we're working on. We have not in the past done the best job at XYZ, and we would like to do a better job. Are you interested in talking about how we can do that? Is a really, in my experience, has been a very effective way to allow people to open up in ways that are like truly informative and can be transformative. And that, of course, depends on what kind of position you're in within your own agency or organization. But I encourage relationships as being some of the most important baseline pieces of equitable resilience, because in a crisis, you call the people you know. And so you want to know people who can help you serve everyone equitably. I also called out faith communities. Now, of course, not everyone belongs to a faith community or a house of worship. But we have found that in terms of making authentic connections to community members, especially community members that have not traditionally been well represented in public processes, faith communities are a different and sometimes more effective way to go. I say like generally almost 100% more effective than like the standard public hearing. But even, your focus group, your workshop may miss a lot of people. And sometimes those people do show up regularly in faith communities, and they put a lot of trust and effort into their relationships related to their faith communities. And so building a relationship with faith leaders, often faith leaders are very in tune with the day-to-day lives of their community members and their needs. And so that can be an effective way to better understand at a kind of grassroots level or at a ground level what's going on in communities where you'd like to be serving people better. The final one I wanted to call out here is employers, just because it's not always a traditional partnership that we think about. I see a lot of folks are either in the public sector, nonprofit, or consultant to the public sector. So we don't always work closely with employers, but actually employers have a ton to do with how people get around. And they may be very knowledgeable about how their employees get to and from their place of work and how it impacts, if they're on time or if they have the energy to do their job well. And then, of course, the other direction is encouraging employers to support non-single occupancy vehicle ways of getting to work. And with kind of the climate lens on that is supporting them even with a consideration of bad weather, of what it takes to bike, walk, roll, use transit to get to work. Next, I encourage you to learn about risks, and this can look in any different number of ways. We've talked a lot about how weather can affect our abilities to move around. You may think about what non-car transportation looks like in an emergency, and this is something that was, tragically, infamously made very visible by Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that a lot of people didn't have a car to evacuate with. And those are folks who got stuck in the city when it flooded. And that's not unique to New Orleans. It's not unique to Louisiana. It's something that we still are trying to figure out in North Carolina. So you all as a, bike, walk, roll community have unique expertise in what it would take to do emergency transportation for people who do not have cars. So I encourage you to think about that angle. And then also to think about who's most impacted in your community. Who are those users who rely on biking, walking, and rolling, and what are their priorities for change? And I always encourage us all to go ask those people, because it's very easy to make assumptions about what their priorities are. Like, say you have transit riders, and we're thinking about rain and climate, and we think, oh, we really need more bus shelters. Well, maybe you go and talk to the transit riders and they're like, no, what we really need is for the bus to come more frequently, so we don't have to wait as long. And then, that serves other needs that we have, like, getting where we need in a more timely fashion. So it's just, I just encourage us all to break down some of those barriers and talk to people who are most impacted, because they are the experts. We should treat them like the experts that they are. Some resources to learn about risks. I talked about the climate risk assessment and resilience plan. All of North Carolina is covered by both a state hazard mitigation plan, but your local hazard mitigation plan will be more detailed. And if you can't find that, I can help you find. Most of them are online somewhere. They're kind of an underutilized resource. All of them have a vulnerability assessment that'll just give you some language or some general basic concepts about natural hazards in your area. We have a resource called Natural Hazard Resilience, a quick start guide for North Carolina communities that my team put out. It's also online and should be slightly easier to find, I hope. We're working on a webpage that'll make all of this a little bit easier to find. But it's a guide. It's aimed at local government, but I think it would be relevant for a lot of users who are interested in doing resilience work, but aren't really sure where to start or what that means exactly. And it walks people, it's very short, it's like 14 pages or something. It's a resource about, kind of like I did, how to think about resilience. And then it helps readers identify where they might already be doing stuff related to resilience in their job, and how they can make small changes in what they do to advance resilience in their community. And then finally, it has a section at the end, which I'll come back and talk about in a moment, about if you want to do something more of like a standalone resilience initiative. It provides some kind of step-by-step for that. And then, of course, a really important source of information is you and your community's experiences, your and your community's experiences. And I encourage everyone to go through and document, what happens when it rains, what happens when there's high heat, how does it change transportation, how does it change people's safety and people's experiences? Because that's really important data, and we don't necessarily collect it in any meaningful or systematic way. So that's kind of a, please do that, share it with us. So some suggestions about specific ways, as I talked about, we encourage our stakeholders to integrate equitable resilience into the work they already do. And here's some of the ways that you might think about that. So centering vulnerable users who rely on sidewalks, bike infrastructure, and transit. So not just kind of including them, but putting them in the middle of your work. How does that change what you do? Using in public, if you do public outreach, to encourage people to use non-car transportation, maybe you include information about how to cope with weather. Mapping and documenting lessons learned from past storms. I just talked about that. If you are an agency that funds capital investments, maybe you integrate resilience as a criteria as you evaluate proposals. Transit authority plans, any kind of plan really is a great place to integrate resilience. I called out the Transit Authority, the Federal Transit Administration has done some work on climate resilience. They have some resources. Redundancy in transportation networks. I know redundancy is one of those interesting things because people see it as less efficient, but redundancy is actually very helpful for resilience because in this specific instance, you want to have more than one way to get around, especially for localized flooding. Another way to integrate resilience is to put it into your organization's agenda or strategic plan. I'll say I spend a significant amount of effort just in my own organization, suggesting ways that we might do a better job integrating resilience into stuff we already do. So this doesn't have to be a formal change in language, although it can be. It can also just be, this is just a reminder, we're all internal advocates at our organizations. And a final thing is including in your budget, if you're a capital organization, considering budgetary needs for repairs and ensuring that those repairs aren't just for vehicle roads, but that they also consider sidewalks, bike paths, other infrastructure for other modes of transportation. I wanted to briefly show you how transportation generally gets talked about in the resilience world. I called it the mainstream discussion. Maybe that's a little disparaging, but I just wanted to give you a sense of that so that you might be able to take that knowledge and apply the lens of bike, walk, roll, and see how we could tweak some of that to be more inclusive of those modes of transportation. So the consider question is basically, how can the mainstream shop talk about resilience in transportation, how can it be adapted to better serve bike, walk, and roll? So the general conversations we tend to have are, where will roads be temporarily or permanently inundated by current flooding, future flooding, and sea level rise? So that's like kind of looking on a map. If we do an aerial view of our transportation network, where are we looking at permanent flooding or more frequent flooding in the future? And so we generally do this for center lines of roads, but really we should be doing it for we should make sure that sidewalks are considered. We should make sure that bike lanes, that bike paths are included in these kinds of analyses. Is stormwater infrastructure large enough to handle larger rainstorms? Again, this is kind of jargony, but this is just about culverts. It's about the size of the tunnels underneath your transportation assets that handle water. But often, when we see that culverts aren't big enough, it's the sides of the roads that tend to flood first, right? And where are the bike, walk, roll users using the road? They're using it at the side. Are pavement and tracks going to fail faster in higher temperatures? Sometimes our sidewalks or our non-vehicle transportation infrastructure is made out of something different, a different material, literally, than our roads. So make sure that we're considering those materials in these analyses. And then a consideration of when we talk about making transportation more resilient, we talk about elevating roads out of floodplains. That's actually a very expensive solution that we don't talk about a ton. I borrowed these 2 slides from my boss's presentation, which was actually about, transportation resilience. So everyone wants to kind of elevate roads out of floodplains, but actually it's very expensive to do. But if you live somewhere where they're considering doing that, or where that's on the table, make sure that the infrastructure to bike, walk, or use a wheelchair is included in that. Especially if it's already present on the ground, make sure that there's budget to include that in the elevation. Upsize culverts, that's making those storm pipes bigger. Relocate facilities out of floodplains. And I would say even think about, when we're building new facilities, what do we want to be out of floodplains? And this is kind of challenging because, like I said, a lot of our recreational amenities are along stream banks and waterways, and they're really beautiful. And we don't want to take that away, but we want to make sure that there are also facilities that function that are outside of floodplains that can work for us if there is a flood. Accommodating more frequent maintenance, and prioritizing projects to create redundancy in emergencies. I think I talked about that, but just highlighting that these are things that we talk a lot about with respect to road infrastructure and vehicles, and we should also be including them in a consideration of safe infrastructure for safe travel by walking, biking, and rolling. So I'm actually, in light of the time, going to skip this slide. This is kind of about how to do a resilience initiative, and I'd be happy to talk about it if there's someone wants to ask a question about it, but it's also in that natural hazards resilience resource. So I'm just going to skip over that. The last thing I want to talk about is a new program that we're starting. We just launched it. It's called the Resilient Communities Program, and it's an effort by our state agency and state government across a few agencies, as well as the North Carolina Rural Center, to help communities build the capacity they need to identify their own resilience priorities. So we'll be helping communities with risk and vulnerability assessments of the people and the assets in their area. We'll be helping places develop portfolios of resilience projects that respond to their self-identified priorities. And we have pilot funding to do this in coastal municipalities and in rural regions that were impacted by Hurricane Florence. And that has to do with the funding mechanisms, but we are aggressively looking for opportunities to expand this across the state. But I did want to mention that geography in case there are people at the summit today who work in those geographies. You should know this program is coming out, and there are ways to participate, and let me know if you want more information. And then finally, to link communities to funding streams for project implementation. And I hope this would be a little bit exciting to people who are on the webinar today, because the resilience funding world, there are a number of streams of federal money that go toward resilience related capital projects that might not be sort of in your, if you think about bike, walk, roll infrastructure and the funding sources for that, you might not be thinking about some of these resilience funding mechanisms, but they actually might be good fits for upgrading or adding, or really any number of things related to your system that supports biking, walking, and rolling. So that's it. Thank you for sitting here and listening while I talked for quite a long time. My contact information is on this slide. I encourage all of you to reach out. We are charting new territory. I should say our office is less than 2 years old, and our resilience team, we came on about 1.5 years ago, and we're always kind of charting our new, figuring out what our role is. And I will say this is the first time I've given a presentation like this, and I really wanted to because I am personally very passionate about particularly pedestrian safety and getting around. And I also have been a bike commuter for as long as I've been a worker. Just like, I don't know, a lot of years at this point, like at least 15. So it's kind of and I'm very passionate about social equity. So this is a personal area that I'm very excited about figuring out what we can do in this arena. So I encourage you all to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda. That was a great presentation, very informative, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the questions portion now. We do have a good 10 minutes for questions, so we can get through most of the ones that you all asked. There's some great questions in here. Why don't we start with this first one? Richie asked, are disabled people offered any kind of relocation assistance when threatened or displaced by climate change? Specifically relocation to places with increased transportation access?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And while we don't specifically serve people with disabilities, we do have a program to help people move out of vulnerable areas. We call it a buyout program. And basically we have funds to purchase the homes of people who mostly live in floodplains, usually in inland floodplains. And then with those funds, we provide some extra funding so that they are able to afford to move into equivalent housing in a safer area. And then what actually happens is the structure itself is demolished and the land has to remain open space in perpetuity. That's part of the conditions of the program. But the question is, this is an area that we need to work more on, like as a nation in our policy, is we don't know where people are moving to when they take buyouts. Buyouts are one of our most important risk reduction strategies right now. And I don't know if they are moving to places with better transportation access, but they should be. And ideally, we're doing planning to figure out where people can move to and where there is growth in their communities that's also served by transportation of different types. So that is a great question. I don't have a super satisfying answer except to say what we are doing. And there is a need for, in general, in North Carolina and across the nation, to do a better job with figuring out where people are moving once they take this buyout.
Great, thank you. So we had a couple questions that are both related to tree canopy. Mm-hmm. One was, are there any efforts to increase the tree canopy in areas where you're doing recovery work after catastrophic events? And then the other question was whether your office gives grants for tree planting in low income / marginalized communities which have little to no tree cover.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are both great questions, and they are both tend to be handled at the local level. And I do know that there are communities that are kind of document the trees that are lost after a hurricane. And a lot of local governments have a tree ordinance or a tree policy that usually specifies the types of trees that they want to have planted. And typically a consideration in those types of trees is the ones that will like withstand high winds and be safe. But that does happen more at the local level. And then we do provide grants and loans to local governments. My understanding is that they tend to be for like basic, I'm not gonna say something that is wrong, but they are related to recovery and resilience needs. And I don't know if any of our local government loan and grant loans or grants have been issued to communities to do tree canopy work. But it would have had to have been in a disaster impacted area. But it would be great. I think what this person is probably saying is that if there should be a funding source to do this work more broadly, to increase the tree canopy in places that aren't served by a full tree canopy. And I know that work is underway in some cities, especially in places that have more kind of staff capacity to do work like that. But it's needed in more places than just in those particular cities that are doing it.
Definitely. Thank you for that. The next question is, does BWNC have any ability to influence reallocation of transportation funds from building more roads, which, as we all know, leads to more flooding usually, to investing more in non-car modes of transportation?
The short answer is no. We don't have any influence in transportation allocations. But the longer answer is that we try to, as resilience professionals, we're always trying to get people to think about like bigger consequences of like building more roads or where new housing is developed, because it has consequences for resilience and climate change, but it also has consequences for people's day-to-day lives, for example, in their transportation choices. But I am hoping out of this conversation to sort of be more informed about how we can be including this discussion of expanding access to different modes of transportation and improving safety of those modes of transportation as a part of becoming more resilient to climate change.
Great, thank you. So we'll wrap up with this last question, which is both an example and then a question at the end. So this person gave an example of a city where the first phase of design and development of a bus rapid transit system did not feature active transportation infrastructure like wide sidewalks, bicycle pathways, adequate bicycle parking. And they asked, why is it that transportation designs are not leading the public? Why does the public need to request or demand it? So
this is,
yeah, would love to know your thoughts on that.
This is such a great question. And I have a corollary. I work more on housing generally, and there is a demand for different types of housing, especially for like smaller sized housing or accessory dwelling, like little tiny houses, that's what I'm trying to say. And the market and local government have often sort of just not wanted to go there. And I think there's just this inherent conservatism to, when we spend a lot of money, we want to spend it on things that we know work. Like, we are comfortable with cars. We know how to design for cars. So we're spending a lot of money. Let's do that. And I mean, I don't have a great, I mean, I think there are opportunities, like when you have somebody who's an elected official or someone who's in an influential position, sometimes they can be sort of an entrepreneur and push that agenda. But I just think that there's this general conservatism, not in the like political sense, just in a like, we feel that that's a little bit risky as an investment. And it is very frustrating. And I completely acknowledge that. And it's why it's so important that there are advocates out there who are doing the work to advocate for active transportation infrastructure. But it's just sort of this, like, it's not, I don't think it's generally like a antagonism towards those modes of transportation. I think it's just like people thinking, oh, is Charlotte, like, it's like, I guess, people don't assume any induced demand. Like people aren't assuming that if you build nice sidewalks, people will walk. They think if you build nice sidewalks, they might go to waste. And so it's kind of trying to shift that mindset into, well, we need infrastructure that makes it safe to bike and walk and roll, and that will make it more popular. But without that infrastructure, it is more difficult to add people to our population of people, add users to our existing pool of people who are biking, walking, and rolling.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. Really appreciate hearing your thoughts on that and on everything else in this presentation. This was incredibly informative and incredibly timely, especially for today, where we are at an interesting turning point where we're going to see how our state and our country is handling climate change and equity going forward. So very timely presentation, and thank you so much. If anyone has additional questions, you can see Amanda's email on the screen there, amanda.martin@ncdps.gov. And with that, we're going to go ahead and hand it back to Terry to wrap us up and give out some prizes.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Thanks very much, Amanda. Give me a second just to get things squared away, and we'll begin that conversation.
Should I unshare my screen?
I've taken care of that. We'll get there. Yep. All right, great. I'm just trying to get things set up to where I can feel, there we go. Great. Super. So hopefully everybody can see our slideshow going through as I begin my conversation now. I want to thank everybody for being here, but before we get to the prizes, I've got to kind of go through this wrap up piece for this incredible last 2 days. It really has been remarkable on so many levels. I've been inspired and shocked and amazed by the education, commitment, and passion by every single participant and presenter during this 2020 Bike Walk North Carolina Summit. As you know, we are the state's only statewide advocacy organization working on these issues, and your support, your engagement is really part of the conversation that makes us effective at the state level. It's been a challenge to make this happen in such short order, and to make it happen digitally in such a way where it flows and is consistent with our messaging, not only looking backwards, but moving forward as well. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop for a moment and let Heidi join in. And as she's doing that, she's going to be reading out names and prizes that have been donated through the incredible sponsors that you see on your screen right now. And we also have a list of 60 other prizes that will be reaching out to you as you've been selected to be a winner through email, and we'll get your mailing address to send those to you. But Heidi, do you want to go ahead and bring up your screen, and I'll try to bring you to your video.
Well, I do have the screen. I don't know that I need to share it.
Okay.
But
All right.
Okay, so
Great.
hello, everybody. See, I let Terry do the hard stuff, and then I come in and give away prizes. It works out great. Terry, are you going to say anything after the prizes just to let people know about what's
I am.
happening?
I've got a few things to say about moving forward, but I wanted to kind of make sure we get that prize list out of the way to let folks know. Okay.
So we had several prizes donated by East Coast Greenway, the Flying Bike, and Kitspo. If you don't know who Kitspo is, I'll put a note in the chat box. I'll put links to all these places because they're all worth exploring. We have 9 sort of individual prizes, and then as Terry mentioned, we got 60 sort of top quality pieces of PPE from Kitspo, which is a company in North Carolina. They do a lot of their manufacturing in North Carolina. They make beautiful apparel for outdoors. It looks like regular clothing, but it's technical. They also have technical clothing. Check them out, please. They've been so generous. So I'm going to read out the individual prizes, and for the PPEs, oh, by the way, our former board member, Simon, put this list together. He did this for a raffle we did before. So it was already, we've drawn them digitally, but with, no preference to anybody in particular. So I'll give out the 9, and then for the other 60 of you, I'll post the list in the program folder, and I will be contacting all of you for your mailing addresses so that we can send you your PPE. So the first prize is an e-bike tour for 2 people from the Flying Bike. It is the perfect way to tour Asheville, and Richie Roselle donated this. And the winner is Barbara Tipton, who looks like she's from UNCG and a student. So congratulations, Barbara. The next prize is an East Coast Greenway t-shirt with the beautiful logo from East Coast Greenway on it. And I will send you a link to Debbie West, and you can talk to her about the right size. And the winner of that is Rick Owen, who looks like he's from the town of Banner Elk. The next prize is an East Coast Greenway jersey, and they are gorgeous, I'm just going to say. Again, we'll put you in contact with East Coast Greenway to get the right size. The winner for that is Tristan Winkler from Land of Sky. So congratulations to you 3. The next 2 prizes are Old Fort Ride House t-shirts. And Old Fort Ride House is connected to Kitspo. It's in the city of Old Fort in the mountains of North Carolina. It's a great place to start a ride from, or get a cup of coffee from, or someday soon hang out with your friends and just gather there. We have 2 t-shirts from there. We will put you in touch with David Billstrom. He will get your sizes and mail them to you. First winner is Brian Wirt, and the second winner is Kim Roney. Congratulations. The next 2 prizes are 2 great hats, also from Kitspo. And again, we'll put you in touch with them to give them your addresses. The first winner, this seems so appropriate, is Mike Sewell from Asheville on Bikes. I can see him wearing it already. And the other one is Tab Tab Combs. So congratulations. And the last two prizes are 2 one-year memberships to the East Coast Greenway, which, as Terry and I know, putting your name to a group that's trying to do so much work is a great thing. So you will now be members of that effort to support the East Coast Greenway. And if you already are a member of the East Coast Greenway, you can give it as a gift to somebody. And those two winners are Paige Curtin and Rose Boges. I have your emails right if I got your pronunciations wrong. So, and then the other prizes that will be given, we have 20 face shields that are, just look at Kitsbo's site, they're gorgeous. 20 in a size small, medium, 20 in a large, extra large. We have 20 face shields that are clear, and then we have 10 other medium face masks. So you will be getting, these are all going to be posted in the program folder. Please look at the program folder. Please look at the program. A lot of time went into it, and there are a lot of links in there to great things. So that is it. Congratulations to all the winners. And Terry, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Heidi. And I want everybody to take a moment to stick with us here just for a little while longer. You've come this far, you can go a little bit further, I think. I want to make sure that you say in the thanks what a great job Heidi has done in organizing this summit and executing it. And again, that resource of the program is really amazing. The summit will continue in many respects over the next 2 or 3 days. We've got several videos that we pre-recorded. We just couldn't stack them into the time that we had and do them live. Really great resources, really great tools. Everybody on the planning organization in Durham who stuck with it when COVID hit. We had upwards of 25, 26 folks at one time on the planning team hoping to make this happen in Durham. Thank you to each and every one of you who stuck with us and helped us transition into this digital format this year. We really hope to be in Durham next year, and we hope that you'll step up again to bring our summit back to you live, or a hybrid or something like that, to have an experience in Durham to make real some of the things we discussed today. Lastly, I really need to thank our board. We're always seeking new, passionate, committed people to step up their commitment to action and join Bike Walk North Carolina's board. Every single one of our board members carried their own water in making this happen, from social media to planning to sponsorships to engagements. And most importantly, you met many of the planning committee, many of our board members as the moderators in the sessions over the last 2 days. So we have faces to names and names to faces now. And that leads me to our registration. We hope that you'll reach out to each and every one who inspired you, who questioned you, who gave information that you want more of. Reach out to them in the email list. You should have been able to check a box when you registered, letting folks know it was okay to share your information. If not, you can reach out to Bike Walk North Carolina and get more information. We'll make the connection for you. Lastly, I really needed to thank an individual who worked tirelessly. Every second that we were on for you, we had Loretta Armstrong doing our closed caption, and she's still doing it now. An amazing job providing the level of accessibility that we haven't seen in a very long time. Certainly not for our Bike Walk Summit. For each and every session, we had as much availability to the information we were sharing as presenters and behind the scenes as we could. So again, thank you to Loretta. And if you actually used it, and I certainly did many times, I was very appreciative to have Loretta doing real-time captioning. So thank you, Loretta, and I hope you'll thank her too. We also have the AICP credits. So make sure you keep your program and use that program as a resource for your AICP credits. Let's see, I think that covers most of the kind of thank yous that we can begin with, but again, I can't thank Heidi enough for what she has done. But I want to recap the summit just in a quick few minutes for folks that are still here. You know, we talked about the types of technology in the cycling and walking world that are coming. You know, e-bikes are here, and they're going to be a part of our future in transportation. We learned a lot about engagement toolkits throughout the summit. That equity and engagement and the equity in transportation is our theme, not only for the summit, but for next year as well. You know, we learned about some specific projects that are really inspiring in Greensboro and in Raleigh. And for me, as a statewide leader, I can see those projects transplanting into every community in North Carolina, rural or urban. They all have a place, and we all have to make sure that they're elevated at the General Assembly and with the North Carolina Department of Transportation. I hope you all participated in some of the state and national conversations that we had with NCDOT and the League of American Bicyclists. Really amazing. And really the last one for climate, that is an over-encompassing conversation that we need to have moving forward this year. We need newer cars, yes, right? We need newer cars, yes. We need more facilities for active transportation for everyone. But we really need opportunities to reduce the number of vehicles on our road, to reduce congestion, to improve safety, and to slow things down where people can survive and thrive in our sustainable transportation system in North Carolina. Really amazing, and that leads us to what we're going to be working on in 2021. We have to push through for funding at every level, from North Carolina Department of Transportation and their prioritization programming, to move away from building roads and infrastructure for vehicles only, and really prioritize that integrated mobility division, which includes bicycling and pedestrian facilities, to make that the primary duty of NCDOT and their mission moving forward. That's something we're going to be working on pretty aggressively. Look for communications around a monthly advocacy meeting and an advocacy call to try to help that process along. During this time, from election to inauguration at the state level, it's a great opportunity to reach out to your candidates who have just won, to your candidates who are still in the General Assembly, and let them know what you learned today. Share a story or two from the summit, and let them know how important it is to reprioritize their transportation commitment to North Carolina. I'm really proud of everybody who's played a part in this summit. It's incredibly impressive. Again, for me, my role was really behind the scenes this year because so many people were willing to step up and lead, and we're excited that you're here. You've become great leaders with the information that you received and participated in and sharing during this summit, and I'm really proud of each and every one of you for taking this time. There was one thing about the summit that really shocked me. Everybody has a fear about how are we going to be engaged? Are we Zoom fatigued? But every day, over 100 people a day, and almost 100 people plus were in every single session. And that was really amazing to have that level of commitment by each and every one of you who participated in this year's summit. I'm just very impressed by the participation, the engagement, the questions throughout the summit. So I'll leave that with you for right now. I just want to say thank you again to everyone who sponsored this year's summit. I want to thank everyone at the planning committee in Durham and across the state who participated. Especially want to thank our board members who really have been working and striving to make Bike Walk North Carolina great and to make it a more sustainable organization and reflect the needs of every county in North Carolina. And I am so impressed with everyone who participated. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Have a great weekend. And more importantly, let's continue the conversation. Visit our YouTube channel with those links, and the live sessions are going to be coming online. You'll have access to those videos right away, and make sure that we continue the conversation moving forward with our General Assembly, with our governor, and with our policymakers at NCDOT, at your local RPOs and MPOs, and your local politicians in your cities and counties. So thanks again, everybody. I'm going to say thank you again. to our panelists. Thank you again to the board. Thank you again, especially to Loretta and our closed captioning. And have a great day. Enjoy yourselves. Be safe out there and make a difference in your community. Goodbye, everybody.
Okay, goodbye. Y'all did a great job too from the captioner. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Loretta. You were awesome. You were awesome.
Well, you were too, and I appreciate your thank yous. I don't always get those.
Oh, you were a rock star. Thanks, Loretta.
Okay, hon. Thank you. Bye-bye.